This is Part 5, Volume 1, of the New and Complete Newgate Calendar, read by Roy Schreiber. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Particulars respecting the Lords and other persons who were tried on account of the rebellion in the year 1715, when, in pursuance of the Act of Settlement, King George the First succeeded the throne of thefe realms, the Earl of Mar, a Scottifh nobleman who had been deeply concerned with Queen Anne's Tory ministry, was deprived of all the places he had held under government. In revenge for which, he retired to Scotland, and meditated a scheme to dethrone the king and overturn the constitution. Being assured of the afiftance of a number of Highlanders, he communicated his plan to fome noblemen in Scotland and the north of England, who joined him in fending an invitation to the Pretender to invade thefe kingdoms; and they alfo difpatched 3 men to London to endeavour to enlift soldiers for the Pretender's fervice. The names of thefe men were Robert Whitty, Felix O'Hara, and Joseph Sullivan; and though the bufinefs in which they engaged was of the moft dangerous nature, they continued it for fome time, but were at length apprehended, brought to trial, and being convicted, were executed at Tyburn on the 28th of May, 1715. Robert Whitty was born in Ireland, and having enlifted as a soldier when young, ferved in an Englifh regiment in Spain, where, being wounded, he was brought to England, and received the bounty of Chelsea College as an out pensioner. Felix O'Hara, who was about 29 years of age, was likewife an Irifhman, and having lived fome time in Dublin as a waiter at a tavern, he faved fome money and entered into bufinefs for himfelf; but that not anfwering as he would have wifhed, he came to London. Joseph Sullivan was a native of Munster in Ireland, and about the fame age as O'Hara. He had for fome time ferved in the Irifh brigades, but obtaining his difcharge, he came to England, and was thought a fit agent to engage in the bufinefs which coft him and his companions their lives. Thefe men denied, at the time of their trial, that they had been guilty of any crime, and even at the place of execution they attempted to defend their conduct. They all died profeffing the Roman Catholic religion. Hence, let us learn to abhor the pernicious doctrines of that church which could encourage fubjects in the wifh to dethrone their lawful fovereign; and may we be taught the force of the inftruction, fear God and honour the king. We will now continue the narrative, of which this is but the introduction. The Earl of Mar had resolved to keep his proceedings an absolute fecret, but it is almost impoffible for tranfactions of this nature to remain fo, and information of what had pafled having been transmitted to the court, the king went to the houfe on the 20th of July, 1715, and having fent for the Commons, informed both houfes of Parliament that he had received authentic intelligence of an intention formed by the Pretender to invade his kingdoms, and that he was apprehenfive he had but too many abettors in this country; wherefore, that the ends of public juftice might be speedily obtained, the king requested that the Habeas Corpus Act might be fufpended till the rebellion should be at an end. Accordingly, the legiflature fufpended the faid act, and in confequence of which feveral fufpected perfons were taken into cuftody. The militia was now raifed in different parts of the kingdom, the guards were encamped in Hyde Park, and a number of fhips were ordered to guard the coafts, and other proper fteps taken for public fecurity. The Earl of Mar was by this time at the head of 3000 men, with whom he marched from town to town in Scotland, proclaiming the Pretender by the title of James III. Some of the soldiers in the caftle of Edinburgh, having been bribed to affift fome of the Earl of Mar's men in getting over the walls by means of rope ladders, they were difpatched to furprife the caftle; but Lord Justice Clarke was fo much on his guard, that this fcheme was fruftrated, and fome of the parties concerned in it fuffered death. Chagrined by this circumftance, and hearing that the French king was juft then dead, many of the rebels were for abandoning their enterprize till the arrival of the Pretender. But this intention did not take place, for on the 6th of October, 1715, Thomas Fofter, Efq. Member of Parliament for Northumberland, fet up the Pretender's Standard in that county, and being joined by feveral noblemen and gentlemen, they made an attempt to feize Newcaftle, but did not fucceed. They were afterwards joined by a body of the Scottifh at Kelfo, and after marching to different places, they came to Prefton in Lancafhire. In the mean time, Generals Carpenter and Wills marched into the north, but finding the rebels gone fouthward, they went to Prefton, which place the rebels intended to defend against the King's forces, whom they for fome time annoyed by firing from the windows of the houfes. But at length the royal troops were victorious, and after the lofs of only about 150 men. It is uncertain how many rebels were killed, but the number of prifoners was about 1500, among whom were the Earl of Derwentwater and Lord Widdrington. Thefe two were English peers, the reft Scottish. The Earls of Nithsdale, Winton, Carnwath, Viscount Kenmure, and Lord Nairn. The common soldiers among the rebels were imprisoned at Liverpool, and other places in that neighbourhood. But the above mentioned noblemen, with other perfons above the common rank, to the number of near 300, were brought to London. They arrived at Highgate on the 14th of November, where they were met by a party of the foot guards, and their arms being tied back with cords, their horfes were led each by a grenadier, and in this ignominious manner they were conducted to the metropolis, when the noblemen were committed to the Tower, and the rest to Newgate. In the mean time a number of the Scottish rebels had marched to Perth, where they proclaimed the Pretender, in confequence of which John, Duke of Argyle, who had been commifsioned to raife forces, marched against and came up with them at Sheriffmuir near Dumblane, on the very day of the other engagement, and the rebellion would have been crushed, but that fome of the Duke's troops ran away on firft fire, and got to Stirling, about 7 miles from the field of battle. However, the Duke obtained a partial victory by forcing the enemy lines with his dragoons. The Earl of Mar retired to Perth on the following day, proposing to crofs the Forth, with a view to join the rebels in England, but a fleet lying oppofite Edinburgh prevented this defign from being carried into execution. About this period Sir John Mackenzie, having fortified the town of Inverness for the Pretender, Lord Lovat, at the head of his tenants, drove him from that place, a circumftance of great importance to the royal caufe, as a communication was thereby opened between the Highlands and the Forth of Scotland, and the Earl of Seaforth and the Marquis of Hunley laid down their arms, in confequence of the Earl of Sutherland having armed his tenants in fupport of government. The rebels now went into winter quarters at Perth, and the Duke of Argyle at Stirling, and the Pretender, having landed at Peterhead with 6 attendants only, met his friends at Perth on the 22nd of December, and on the 9th of the following month made a public entry into the palace of Scone, and affuming the dignity of a fovereign prince, issued a proclamation for his coronation, and another for affembling the States. But this farce continued for only a very short time, for General Coggan, arriving with 6,000 Dutch forces to the aid of the Duke of Argyle about the end of January, the latter marched toward Perth, but the rebels fled as foon as they heard he was advancing. For a while they had expectation of aid from France, in the hope of which the Pretender and his adherents went to Dundee, and thence to Montrose. But after waiting a while, and no aid arriving, they began to despair. And as the King's troops purfued them, the common men difperfed to their own habitations, and the Pretender, with the Earl of Mar and fome others of his principal adherents, embarked on board a fhip in the harbour of Montrose, and were foon landed in France, after having narrowly efcaped an English fleet which lay on the coast of Scotland, through the extreme darkness of the night in which they embarked. The difturbances in the north being thus at an end, both houses of Parliament combined to shew their loyalty to their fovereign and regard to the public welfare. Mr. Fofter was expelled from the Houfe of Commons, who unanimously agreed to impeach the 7 Lords, which was accordingly done. Thefe unhappy noblemen were informed of what had pafled, and the Earl Cooper, Lord High Chancellor, being appointed Lord High Steward on the occafion, all the Lords pleaded guilty to the indictment, except the Earl of Winton; but they offered fuch pleas in extenuation of their crimes as they thought might induce the King to extend his royal mercy to them; and the Earl of Derwentwater hinted that the proceedings of the Houfe of Commons in the impeachment was out of the ordinary courfe of law. In confequence of their having pleaded guilty, proclamation was made for filence, and the Lord High Steward paffed fentence of death on them, prefacing the folemn fentence with the following affecting fpeech: James Earl of Derwentwater, William Lord Widdrington, William Earl of Nithsdale, Robert Earl of Carnwith, William Viscount Kenmure, William Lord Nairn, you stand impeached by the Commons of Great Britain, in Parliament affembled, of high treafon, in traitoroufly imagining and compaffing the death of his moft facred Majefty, and in confpiring for that end to levy a bloody and deftructive war againft his Majefty, in order to depole and murder him; and in levying war accordingly, and proclaiming a pretender to his crown to be King of thefe realms. Which impeachment, though one of your lordfhips in the introduction to his plea fuppofes to be out of the ordinary and common courfe of law and juftice, is yet as much a courfe of proceeding according to the common law as any other whatfoever. If you had been indicted, the indictment muft have been removed, and brought before the Houfe of Lords, the Parliament fitting. In that cafe you had, 'tis true, been accused only by the grand jury of one country. In the prefent, the whole body of the Commons of Great Britain, by their reprefentatives, are your accufers; and this circumftance is very obfervable, to exclude all poffible fuppofition of hardfhip as to the method of proceeding againft you, that however all great affemblies are apt to differ on other points, you were impeached by the unanimous opinion of the Houfe of Commons, not one contradicting. They found themfelves, it feems, fo much concerned in the prefervation of his moft truly facred Majefty and the Protestant fucceffion, the very life and foul of thefe kingdoms, that they could not omit the firft opportunity of taking their proper part, in order to fo fignal and neceffary an act of his Majefty's juftice. And thus the whole body politic of this free kingdom has in a manner rofe up in its own defence, for the punishment of thofe crimes which it was rightly apprehended had a direct tendency to the everlafting diflolution of it. To this impeachment you have feverally pleaded, and acknowledged yourfelves guilty of the high treafon therein contained. Your pleas are accompanied with fome variety of matter to mitigate your offences, and to obtain mercy; part of which, as fome of the circumftances said to have attended your furrender, feeming to be offered rather as an argument only for mercy, than any thing in mitigation of your preceding guilt, is not proper for me to take notice of; but, as to the other part, which is meant to extenuate the crimes of which you are convicted, it is fit I should take this occafion to make fome obfervations to your lordfhips upon it, to the end that the judgment to be given againft you may clearly appear to be juft and righteous as well as legal, and that you may not remain under any fatal error in respect of a greater judicature, by reflecting with lefs horror and remorfe on the guilt you have contracted than it really deferves. It is alledged by fome of your lordfhips, that you engaged in this rebellion without previous concert or deliberation, and without fuitable preparation of men, horfes, and arms. If this should be fuppofedly true, on fome of your lordfhips averring it, I defire you to confider, that as it exempts you from the circumftance of contriving this treafon, fo it very much aggravates your guilt in that part you have undoubtedly borne in the execution of it. For it fhews that your inclination to rebel were fo well known, which could only be from a continued feries of your words and actions, that the contrivers of that horrid defign depended upon you, and therein judged rightly, that your zeal to engage in this treafon was fo ftrong as to carry you into it on the leaft warning, and the very firft invitation, that you would not excufe yourfelves by want of preparation, as you might have done, and that rather than not have fhare in the rebellion, you would plunge yourfelf into it almost naked and unprovided for fuch an enterprize. In fhort, that your men, horfes, and arms were not fo well prepared as they might, and would have been, on longer warning, but your minds were. It is alfo alleged, as an extenuation of your crimes, that no cruel or harfh action, I fuppofe is meant no rapine, or plunder, or worfe, had been committed by you. This may, in part only, be true, but then your lordfhips will at the fame time confider, that having laid wafte a tract of land bears but a little portion, in point of guilt, compared with that crime of which you stand convicted, an open attempt to deftroy the beft of kings, to ruin the whole fabric, and raze the very foundations of a government, the beft fuited of any in the world to perfect the happiness and fupport the dignity of human nature. The former offence caufes but a mifchief that is foon recovered, and is ufually pretty much confined. The latter, had it fucceeded, muft have brought a lafting and univerfal deftruction on the whole kingdom. Befides, much of this was owing to accident, and your march was fo haftily, partly to avoid the king's troops, and partly from a vain hope to ftir up infurrections in all the counties you paffed through, that you had no time to fpread devaftation without deviating from your main, and, as I have obferved, much worfe defign. Father, 'tis very furprifing that any concern in this rebellion fhould lay their engaging in it on government's doing a neceffary and an ufual act in like cafes, for its prefervation. The giving orders to confine fuch as were moft likely to join in that treafon. 'Tis hard to believe that any one should rebel merely to avoid being reftrained from rebelling, or that a gentle confinement would not much better have fuited a crazy ftate of health, than the fatigues and inconvenience of fuch a long and hafty march in the depth of winter. Your lordfhip's rifing in arms, therefore, has much more juftified the prudence and fitnefs of thofe orders, than thofe orders will in any wife ferve to mitigate your treafon. Alas! happy had it been for all your lordfhips, had you fallen under fo indulgent a reftraint. When your lordfhips fhall in good earneft apply yourfelves to think impartially on your cafe, furely you will not yourfelves believe that it is poffible in the nature of the thing to be engaged, and continue fo long engaged, in fuch a difficult and laborious enterprize, through rafhnefs, furprize, and inadvertency; or that had the attack at Prefton been lefs fudden, and confequently the rebels better prepared to receive it, your lordfhips had been reduced the fooner, and with lefs, if not without any bloodfhed. No, my lords, thefe and fuch like are artful colourings proceeding from minds filled with expectation of continuing in this world, and not from fuch as are preparing for their defence before a tribunal where the thoughts of the heart and the true fprings and caufes of actions muft be laid open. And now, my lords, having thus removed fome falfe colours you have ufed, to affift you yet further in that neceffary work of thinking on your great offences as you ought, I proceed to touch upon feveral circumftances that feem greatly to aggravate your crime, and which will deferve your moft ferious confideration. The divine virtues, 'tis one of your lordfhip's own epithets, which all the world as well as your lordfhips acknowledge to be in his Majefty, and which you now lay claim to, ought certainly to have withheld your hands from endeavouring to depofe, to deftroy, to murder that moft excellent prince. So the impeachment fpeaks, and fo the law conftrues your actions. And this is not only true of the notion of law, but almoft always fo in the deed and reafon. 'Tis a trite but a very true remark, that there are very few hours between kings being reduced under the power of pretenders to their crown and their graves. Had you fucceeded, his Majefty's cafe would, I fear, have hardly been an exception to the general rule, fince 'tis highly improbable that flight should have faved any of that illuftrious and valiant family. 'Tis a further aggravation of your crime, that his Majefty, whom your lordfhips would have dethroned, affected not the crown by force, or by arts of ambition, but fucceeded peacefully and legally to it, and on the deceafe of her late Majefty without iffue, became undoubtedly the next in courfe of defcent capable of fucceeding to the crown. By law and conftitution of this kingdom, as it stood declared fome years before the crown was expressly limited to the houfe of Hanover. This right was acknowledged, and the defcent of the crown limited or confirmed accordingly by the whole legiflature in 2 fucceffive reigns, and more than once in the latter, which your lordfhip's accomplices are very far from allowing would bias the nation to that fide. How could it then enter into the heart of man to think that private perfons might with a good confcience endeavour to fubvert fuch a fettlement, by running to tumultuary arms, and by intoxicating the dregs of the people with contrary opinions and groundlefs flanders, or that God's providence would ever profper fuch wicked, fuch ruinous attempts? Especially if, in the next place, it be confidered that the moft fertile inventions on the fide of the rebellion have not been able to affign the leaft fhadow of a grievance as the caufe of it. To fuch poor fhifts have they been reduced on this head, that for want of better colours, it has been objected in a folemn manner, by your lordfhip's affociates, to his Majefty's government, that his people do not enjoy the fruits of peace, as our neighbours have done, fince the laft war. Thus they firft rob us of our peace, and then upbraid us that we have it not. It is a monftrous rebellion that can find no fault with the government it invades, but what is the effect of the rebellion itself. Your lordfhips will likewife do well to confider what an additional burden your treafon has made neceffary on the people of this kingdom, who wanted and were about to enjoy fome refpite. To this end, 'tis well known that all new or increafe of taxes were the laft year carefully avoided, and his Majefty was contented to have no more forces than were juft fufficient to attend his perfon, and to fhut the gates of a few garrifons. But what his Majefty thus did for the eafe and quiet of his people, you moft ungratefully turned to his difadvantage, by taking encouragement from thence to endanger his and his kingdom's fafety, and to bring oppreffion on your fellow fubjects. Your lordfhips obferve, I avoid expatiating on the miferies of a civil war, a very large and copious fubject. I fhall but barely fuggeft to you on that head, that whatever thofe calamities may happen to be, in the prefent cafe all who are at any time, or in any place, partakers in the rebellion, efpecially perfons of figure and diftinction, are in fome degree refponfible for them. And therefore your lordfhips muft not hold yourfelves quite clear from the guilt of thofe barbarities which have been lately committed by fuch as are engaged in the fame treafon with you, and not yet perfectly reduced, in burning the habitations of their countrymen, and thereby expofing many thousands to cold and hunger in this rigorous feafon. I muft be fo juft to fuch of your lordfhips as profefs the religion of the Church of Rome, that you had one temptation, and that a great one, to engage you in this treafon, which the others had not, in that it was evident fuccefs on your part muft for ever have eftablifhed Popery in this kingdom, and that probably you could never have again fo fair an opportunity. But then, good God, how muft thofe Protestants be covered with confufion who entered into the fame meafures without fo much as capitulating for their religion, that ever I could find from any examination I have feen or heard, or fo much as requiring, much lefs obtaining a frail promife that it should be preferved or even tolerated. It is my duty to exhort your lordfhips thus to think of the aggravations as well as the mitigations, if there be any, of your offences, and if I could have the leaft hopes that the prejudices of habit and education would not be too ftrong for the moft earneft and charitable entreaties, I would beg you would not rely any longer on thofe directors of your confcience, by whofe conduct you have, very probably, been led into this miferable condition; but that your lordfhips would be affifted by fome of thofe pious and learned divines of the Church of England, who have constantly borne the infallible mark of fincere Chriftians, univerfal charity. And now, my lords, nothing remains but that I pronounce upon you, and I am forry that it falls to my lot to do it, that terrible fentence of the law, which muft be the fame that is ufually given againft the meaneft offender in the like kind. The moft ignominious and painful parts of it are ufually remitted, by the grace of the crown, to perfons of your quality; but the law, in this cafe, being deaf to all diftinctions of perfons, requires I fhould pronounce, and accordingly it is adjudged by this court, that you, James Earl of Derwentwater, William Lord Widdrington, William Earl of Nithsdale, Robert Earl of Carnwath, William Viscount Kenmure, and William Lord Nairn, and every of you, return to the prifon of the Tower from whence you came, and from thence you muft be drawn to the place of execution. When you come there you muft be hanged by the neck, but not till you be dead, for you muft be cut down alive, and then your bowels muft be taken out, and burnt before your faces, and then your heads muft be fevered from your bodies, and your bodies divided each into 4 quarters, and thefe muft be at the King's difpofal, and God Almighty be merciful to your fouls. After fentence thus paffed, the lords were remanded back to the Tower, and on the 18th of February orders were fent to the lieutenant of the Tower and the fheriffs for their execution, and great folicitations were made in favour of them, which did not only reach the court, but came down to the 2 houfes of Parliament, and petitions were delivered in both, which being backed by fome, occafioned debates. That in the Houfe of Commons arofe no higher than to occafion a motion for adjournment, thereby to prevent any further interpofition there. But the matter in the Houfe of Peers was carried on with more fuccefs, where their petitions were delivered and spoke to, and it was carried by 9 or 10 voices, that the fame should be received and read; and the queftion was put, whether the King had the power to reprieve in cafe of impeachment, which being carried in the affirmative, a motion was made to addrefs his Majefty to defire him to grant a reprieve to the lords under fentence; but the movers thereof only obtained this claufe, viz. To reprieve fuch of the condemned lords as deferve his mercy, and that the time of the refpite should be left to his Majefty's difcretion." To which addrefs his Majefty replied, "that to this and other occafions he would do what he thought moft confiftent with the dignity of the crown and the fafety of his people." The great parties they had made, as was faid, by means of money, and alfo by the rafh expreffions too common in the mouths of many of their friends, as if the government did not dare to execute them, did not a little contribute to the haftening of their execution. For on the fame day the addrefs was prefented, the 23rd of February, it was resolved in council that the Earl of Derwentwater and Lord Kenmure should be beheaded, and the Earl of Nithsdale, apprehending he should be included in the warrant, made his efcape the evening before, in a woman's riding hood, fuppofed to have been conveyed to him by his mother on a vifit. In the morning of the 24th of February, 3 detachments of life guards went from Whitehall to Tower Hill, and having taken their ftations round the fcaffold, the 2 lords were brought from the Tower at 10 o'clock, and being received by the fheriffs at the bar, were conducted to the Transport Office on Tower Hill, and, at the expiration of an hour, the Earl of Derwentwater fent word that he was ready, on which Sir John Fryer, one of the fheriffs, walked before him to the fcaffold, and when there told him he might have what time he pleafed to prepare himfelf for death. His lordship desired to read a paper which he had written, the substance of which was, that he was forry for having pleaded guilty, that he acknowledged no king but James III, for whom he had an inviolable affection, and that thefe kingdoms would never be happy till the ancient conftitution was reftored, and he wifhed his death might contribute to that defirable end. His lordship profeffed to die a Roman Catholic, and in the postscript to his fpeech faid, "If that prince, who now governs, had given me life, I fhould have thought myself obliged never more to have taken up arms against him." Sir John Fryer, desiring to have the paper, he said he had fent a copy of it to his friends, and then delivered it. He then read fome prayers out of 2 fmall books, and kneeled down to try how the block would fit his neck. This being done, he had again recourfe to his devotions, and having told the executioner that he forgave him, and likewife forgave all his enemies, he directed him to ftrike when he should repeat the words, "Sweet Jesus," the 3rd time. He then kneeled down and faid, "Sweet Jesus, receive my spirit. Sweet Jesus, be merciful to me. Sweet Jesus," and appeared to be proceeding in his prayer, when his head was ftruck off at one blow, and the executioner, taking it up, exhibited it at the 4 corners of the fcaffold, saying, "Behold the head of a traitor. God fave King George." The body was now wrapped in a black baize, and being carried to a coach, was delivered to the friends of the deceafed, and the fcaffold having been cleared, frefh baize put on the block, and fawduft ftrewed, that none of the blood might appear, Lord Kenmure was conducted to the fcaffold. His lordship was a Protestant, and was attended by 2 clergymen, but he declined faying much, telling one of them that he had prudential reafons for not delivering his sentiments, which was fuppofed to arife from his regard to Lord Carnwath, who was his brother-in-law, and was then interceding for the royal mercy, and as his talking in the way that Lord Derwentwater had done might be fuppofed to injure his lordship with thofe moft likely to ferve him. Lord Kenmure, having finifhed his devotions, declared that he forgave the executioner, to whom he made a prefent of 8 guineas. He was attended by a furgeon, who drew his finger over that part of the neck where the blow was to be ftruck, and, being executed as Lord Derwentwater had been, his body was delivered to the care of an undertaker. George, Earl of Winton, not having pleaded guilty with the other lords, was brought to his trial on the 15th of March, when the principal matter urged in his favour was, that he had furrendered at Prefton in confequence of a promife from General Willis to grant him his life, in answer to which it was fworn that no promife of mercy was made, but that the rebels furrendered at difcretion. The Earl of Winton, having left his houfe with 14 or 15 of his fervants, well mounted and armed, his joining Earl Carnwath and Lord Kenmure, his proceeding with the rebels through the various ftages of their march, and his furrendering with the reft, were circumftances fully proved, notwithstanding which his council moved in arreft of judgment. But the plea on which this motion was founded being thought infufficient, his peers unanimously found him guilty, and then the Lord High Steward pronounced fentence on him, having addreffed him in the following forcible terms: George, Earl of Winton, I have acquainted you that your peers have found you guilty, that is, in terms of the law, convicted you of high treafon whereof you stand impeached. After your lordfhip has moved in arreft of judgment, and their lordfhips have difallowed that motion, their next ftep is to proceed to judgment. The melancholy part I am to bear in pronouncing that judgment upon you, fince it is his Majefty's pleafure to appoint me to that office, I dutifully submit to it, very far from taking any fatisfaction in it. Till conviction your lordfhip has been spoken to without the leaft prejudice or fuppofition of your guilt, but now it muft be taken for granted that your lordfhip is guilty of the high treafon whereof you stand impeached. My lord, this your crime is the greateft known to the law of this kingdom, or any other country whatfoever, and it is the blackeft and moft odious fpecies of that crime, a confpiracy and attempt manifefted by an open rebellion to depofe and murder that facred perfon who fuftains and is Majefty of the whole, and from whom, as from a fountain of warmth and glory, are difperfed all honours, all the dignity of the ftate, indeed the lafting and operative life and vigour of the laws, which plainly fubfift by a due administration of the executive power. So that attempting this precious life is really ftriking at the moft noble part, the feat of life, and the fpring of all motion in this government, and may therefore properly be called a defign to murder not only the king, but alfo the body politic of this kingdom. And this is moft inevitably true in your lordfhip's cafe, considering that fuccefs in your treafon must infallibly have eftablifhed popery, and that never fails to bring with it a civil as well as ecclesiaftic tyranny, which is quite another fort of conftitution than that of this kingdom, and cannot take place till the prefent is annihilated. This your crime, fo I muft call it, is the more aggravated, in that where it proceeds fo far as to take arms openly, and to make an offenfive war against lawful authority, it is generally, as in your cafe, complicated with the horrid and crying fin of murdering many who are not only innocent but meritorious. And if pity be due, as I admit it is to fome degree, to fuch as fuffer for their own crimes, it muft be admitted a much greater fhare of compaffion is owing to them who have loft their lives merely by the crimes of other men. As many as have done fo in the late rebellion, fo many murders have they to anfwer for who promoted it. And your lordfhip, in examining your confcience, will be under a great delufion if you look on thofe who fell at Prefton, Dunblane, or elfewhere, on the fide of the laws, and defence of fettled order and government, as flain in lawful war, even judging of this matter by the law of nations. Alas, my lord, your crime of high treafon is yet made redder by fhedding a great deal of the beft blood in the kingdom. I include in this expreffion the brave common soldiers, as well as thofe gallant and heroic officers, who continued faithful to death, in defence of the laws. For fure but little blood can be better than that which is shed while it is warm in the caufe of true religion and the liberties of its native country. I believe it, notwithstanding the unfair arts and induftry ufed to ftir up a pernicious excefs of commiferation towards fuch as have fallen by the fword of juftice, few, if compared with the number of good fubjects murdered from doors and windows at Prefton only. The life of one honeft loyal fubject is more precious in the eye of God and all considering men, than the lives of many rebels and patricides. This puts me in mind to obferve to your lordfhip, that there is another malignity in your lordfhip's crime, open rebellion, which confifts in this, that it is always fure of doing hurt to a government in one refpect, though it be defeated. I will not fay it does fo on the whole matter, for if the offence is too notorious to be let pafs unobferved by any connivance, then is government reduced to this dilemma: if it be not punifhed, the ftate is endangered by fuffering examples to appear, that it may be attacked with impunity; if it be punifhed, they who are publicly or privately favourers of the treafon, and perhaps fome out of mere folly, raife undeferved clamours of cruelty against thofe in power, or, the loweft their malice flies, is to make unfeafonable, unlimited, and injudicious oeconomies upon mercy and forgiveness, things, rightly ufed, certainly of the greateft excellence. And this proceeding, it muft be admitted, does harm with filly and undiftinguifhing people, fo that the rebels have the fatisfaction of thinking they hurt the government a little even by their fall. The only but true confolation every wife government has in fuch a cafe, after it has tempered juftice with mercy in fuch proportion as found difcretion directs, having always a care for the public fafety above all things, is this, that fuch like feeds of unreafonable difcontents take root on very fhallow foil only, and that therefore, after they have made a weak fhoot, they foon wither and come to nothing. It is well your lordfhip has given an opportunity of doing the government right on the fubject of your furrender at Prefton. How confidently had it been given out by the faction that the furrender was made on affurance, at leaft hopes, insinuated of pardon; whereas the truth appears to be that the fear was the only motive to it. The evil day was deferred, and the rebels rightly depended fewer would die at laft by meafures they elected, than if they had stood an affault. They were awed by the experienced courage, difcipline, and ftedfaftnefs of the King's troops, and by the superior genius and spirit of his Majefty's commander over thofe rebels; fo that in truth they were never flattered with any other terms than to furrender as rebels and traitors, their lives only to be fpared till his Majefty's pleafure be known. It was indeed a debt due thofe brave commanders and foldiers, to whom their king and country owe more than can be well expreffed, that their victory should be vindicated to the present and future ages from untrue detraction, and kept from being sullied by the tongues of rebels and their accomplices when their arms could no longer hinder it. 'Tis hard to leave this subject without shortly obferving that this engine, which fets the world on fire, a lying tongue, has been of prodigious ufe to the party of the rebels, not only fince and during the rebellion, but before, while it was forming, and the rebels preparing for it. Falfe facts, falfe hopes, falfe characters, have been the greater half of the fcheme they fet out with, and yet feem to depend upon. It has been rightly obferved, your lordfhip's anfwer does not fo much as infift with any clearnefs on that which only could excufe your being taken in open rebellion, that is, you was forced into it, remained fo under force, and would have escaped from it, but could not. If you had fo infifted, it had been clearly proved that that had not been true. for your lordship was active and forward in many inftances, and fo considerable in military capacity among your fellow soldiers as to command a fquadron. Thefe, and other particulars, have been obferved by the managers of the Houfe of Commons, and therefore I fhall not purfue them further, but to conclude this introduction to the fentence, by exhorting your lordship with perfect charity and much earneftnefs to confider that now the time has come when the veil of partiality fhould be taken from your eyes, it muft be fo, for you come to die, and that your lordship fhould henceforward think with clearnefs and indifference, if poffible, which muft produce in you a hearty deteftation of the high crime you have committed, and, being a Proteftant, be very likely to make you a fincere penitent, for your having engaged in a defign that muft have deftroyed the holy religion you profefs, had it taken effect. Nothing now remains but that I pronounce upon you that fentence which law ordains, and which fufficiently fhews what thoughts your anceftors had of the crime of which your lordfhip is now convicted, viz. That you, George, Earl of Witten, &c. Soon after paffing this fentence, the Earls of Witten and Nithsdale found means to efcape out of the Tower, and Meffrs. Fofter and Mackintosh efcaped from Newgate. But it was fuppofed that motives of mercy and tendernefs in the Prince of Wales, afterwards George II, favoured the efcape of all thefe gentlemen. This rebellion occafioned the untimely death of many other perfons. 5 were executed at Manchester, 6 at Wigan, 11 at Prefton, but a confiderable number were brought to London, and being arraigned in the Court of Exchequer, moft of them pleaded guilty, and fuffered the utmoft rigour of the law. The end of Part V, Volume 1, of the New and Complete Newgate Calendar.